One of the most disgusting female concentration camp guards who served inside of camps such as Auschwitz or Bergen-Belsen was the young Elisabeth Volkenrath. Despite her being in her 20s when she was sent to the executioner's gallows inside of Hamelin Prison, alongside other women such as Irma Grese, Elisabeth Volkenrath became a very senior figure in the runnings and the infrastructure of the camps. She was a woman who was respected by the SS, and she demonstrated pure hatred, horror and slaughter with her work inside the camps, and she was at the end of the Second World War arrested for her crimes and was brought to trial. But following her execution at the hands of the British executioner Albert Pierrepoint, Elisabeth Volkenrath's story was not over, as her coffin was actually exhumed years after from the prison yard where it had been buried, and she was then moved elsewhere. But why did this happen when many other Nazi war criminals were cremated, their ashes scattered and then forgotten about? Still today the remains of the evil female guard of Bergen-Belsen do exist on Earth. Welcome to the Untold Past. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Elisabeth Volkenrath was a daughter of a forest worker, and she grew up in a very large family. She had a number of jobs following leaving school, and she served as a cook and also worked as a nanny looking after children. But within the Second World War, she would be sending them to their deaths. Her final job before she served inside of the concentration camps was as a hairdresser, but she had for some time been involved in the Nazi youth groups for young women, and she had been indoctrinated like millions were by the policies of Hitler and the Nazi Party. She was then attracted to go and work for the SS inside the concentration camp system. She signed up to be part of the SS retinue in October 1941 and first worked as an overseer inside of the Ravensbrück concentration camp, an all-female concentration camp. Here Volkenrath was trained by other brutal women, and she was schooled in how to maintain a reign of fear and terror over others, but following her training period, she was then moved across to go and work in the expanding Auschwitz camp in Poland. Elisabeth Volkenrath was one of a number of women who was actually transferred to Auschwitz, and this became the largest site of extermination inside the Third Reich during the Second World War. She served first as a guard inside the camp's tailor shop, overseeing the prisoners working there, before she was transferred to oversee large groups of female prisoners within the women's camp of Auschwitz-Birkenau. While she was there, she caught typhus and was treated inside of hospital, but when she returned she worked inside the post offices in the camp, and she oversaw prisoners who were inspecting different packages that arrived in the camp. She ordered prisoners to inspect absolutely everything, and much of these packages were sent from the Red Cross, and the items and basic necessities inside of them were never given to the prisoners. However, because of her service within the camp, Volkenrath was promoted to camp leader of the women's area, and she was then made the superintendent of the women's camp, but when at Auschwitz, she became involved in slaughter and horror. When she was later brought to trial, she was accused of getting involved in the selections at the camp. Prisoners were sent to Auschwitz by train, and they were then ordered to either go left or right, and those who were deemed not healthy to work were then sent to the gas chambers. Many of those sent to their deaths were women and children, and also the elderly, but Volkenrath was one of those women who patrolled the train yards and decided who was to be slaughtered as soon as they entered the Auschwitz site, and she was also seen driving prisoners onto the trucks that took them to their deaths inside the chambers. She claimed she did not know where these trucks were heading, but this did not fool the judges later. Other prisoners though documented her actions inside of Auschwitz, and they claimed that she regularly beat women, and even admitted to slapping the faces of the prisoners, but she insisted that she never killed or took someone's life. A former inmate named Vera Fischer later at trial stated that she was once beaten so badly by the female guard that she was sent to the camp infirmary for 3 weeks. But Elisabeth Volkenrath was then seen to have beaten on more than 80 different occasions female prisoners, sometimes knocking them out with her rubber truncheon and other weapons. Another former inmate, Helene Herkovitz, also stated that she was forced to run behind a bicycle to the SS headquarters where Volkenrath was. When she got there she was beaten badly and was locked in a cellar and was only given food and water every 3 days. She was then forced to clean the toilets where she contracted typhus and almost died. But further horror occurred as Volkenrath allegedly threw an elderly woman down a flight of stairs, and because this woman was old, then she died from the beating. She also forced other prisoners to take part in strenuous exercises, which was a form of group punishment. She was also accused of striking women so hard that they were knocked out, and one woman who was beaten was forced to kneel down and hold stolen goods above her head for 4 hours. Then Elisabeth Volkenrath took her truncheon to her, and no one was able to help the unconscious girl. But following the evacuation of Auschwitz, she was then sent on to Bergen-Belsen concentration camp on the 5th of February 1945, and she served at Belsen, which was in a state of horror. When the Allies liberated Belsen, they discovered 10,000 corpses around the camp unburied, and there was a huge amount of disease and desperation. They also found a number of SS guards who had remained to allegedly keep law and order at the camp, and one of these women was Volkenrath, who was then forced to help clean up the camp and to bury the bodies which she was responsible for. But when she was imprisoned, many former prisoners came forward about her actions and her brutal violence, and she was then taken to the Belsen trials, where she was condemned to death for getting involved in the selections and the crimes she committed not just at Bergen-Belsen, but also at Auschwitz. She was then sent to Hamelin Prison to sit on death row, alongside other women such as Irma Grese and Johanna Bormann. Let's remember that when she committed most of her crimes, Elisabeth Volkenrath was in her early 20s. But on the 13th of December 1945, inside of Hamelin Prison, Volkenrath was told she would be executed within minutes. In the days before, the British executioner Albert Pierrepoint had recorded her height and weight to work out the drop needed to kill her. Pierrepoint then used a simultaneous gallows, and the women were condemned first, and the very first of the condemned guards of Bergen-Belsen to be executed was Elisabeth Volkenrath. She was summoned from her prison cell, and she was then led up to the gallows before Pierrepoint placed a black cap over her head, followed by the noose. At 9:34 a.m, he released a trapdoor, and Elisabeth Volkenrath was immediately executed, and she was minutes later declared dead, and her remains were then placed inside of a coffin. But this would not be the end. Following being interred inside the prison yard of Hamelin, alongside the other condemned war criminals of the Belsen trials and other Nazi criminals, Elisabeth Volkenrath's remains were left for a number of years to rest. But there then came the time when the British needed to hand over control of Hamelin Prison back to the Germans, and because of this there was a mass exhumation of the executed Nazis of Hamelin, and it was ordered to dig up the remains of Elisabeth Volkenrath. In March 1954, the bodies were exhumed and the ground was broken to dig her up, and the coffin was exhumed. Then a number of specialists identified the body of Elisabeth Volkenrath, and she was then placed inside of a new coffin, ready for reburial elsewhere. In total, 91 bodies of executed Nazi war criminals were exhumed from Hamelin Prison's yard, and Elisabeth Volkenrath had been placed in a new coffin, meaning the old one had to be opened, and she was then taken to the nearby cemetery of Hamelin and Vel, inside of the town. Her body, along with the other Nazi war criminals, was buried in secret next to a path, but this did not remain a secret for long, as there began to be neo-Nazis who started to gather around the new burial site. Some shockingly even wanted to give these people an alleged proper burial. However, to begin with, no memorials were allowed to mark the site of the graves, but then small crosses were allowed. One newspaper at the time wrote, "British occupation authorities refused to interfere with German authorities who moved the bodies from a mass grave to individual plots in the city cemetery, after a campaign by neo-Nazi elements in Hamelin, Lower Saxony. 30 of the 90 bodies of the executed Nazi war criminals have already been moved from a common mass grave near Hamelin and reinterred in the city cemetery. The remaining bodies will be moved later. Amongst those reburied are Josef Kramer, named the Beast of Belsen, by the inmates of the notorious death camp, and Irma Grese, who hounded women prisoners at Belsen." The grave of Elisabeth Volkenrath and the other condemned guards of Bergen-Belsen today is a small patch of grass by a path, and those people who walk by it probably don't realise the people who are buried there were some of the worst war criminals of the Second World War. Volkenrath was responsible for the slaughter and deaths of thousands during the Second World War, and she was a violent female guard whose actions were shocking, as was the fact she was just in her early 20s when she committed most of her crimes. But still today her remains exist on Earth, unlike many other Nazi war criminals who were then cremated following their execution. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.